My wife laughed. You're selling your company? Good. Now you can finally afford the alimony. I just signed the papers. Her lawyer called her, screaming, an hour later because, look, I've sat through some truly awful dinners in my life. There was that time in college when my roommate tried to cook ramen in a coffee maker and nearly burned down our dorm. There was the Thanksgiving when my aunt decided to go vegan and served us something that looked like it had already been digested once. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the sheer theatrical nightmare that was dinner with the Fallners at Marchand's. The kind of restaurant where they don't list prices on the menu because if you have to ask, you probably showed up in the wrong tax bracket. The place was all exposed Edison bulbs and reclaimed barnwood, the kind of aggressively trendy spot where the waiters introduce themselves like they're auditioning for a Netflix drama, and every dish comes with a backstory longer than most people's resumes. Our server, a kid named Dante who looked like he'd been personally victimized by the farm-to-table movement, had just finished explaining that our duck confit was sourced from a heritage farm in the Hudson Valley where the ducks were read poetry and given weekly massages. I'm not making this up. The ducks had a better self-care routine than I did. Madison sat across from me, looking like she'd stepped out of a Saks Fifth Avenue catalog. All sharp angles, designer everything, and the kind of smile that could cut glass if she aimed it right. Her mother, Patricia Fallner, was positioned at the head of the table like a mob boss in Chanel, occasionally dabbing her lips with a napkin that probably cost more than my first car. Madison's sister, Courtney, was giggling into her phone, her laugh sounding exactly like what I imagine a hyena would sound like if it went to Barnard and majored in being insufferable. And then there was Thomas Fallner himself. The great corporate titan, the man whose face had graced the cover of Forbes more times than I'd had hot meals, sitting there with his jaw clenched so tight I was worried he'd crack a molar on his own self-importance. The wine they'd ordered was a 2009 Chateau Margaux that rang in at somewhere north of $800 a bottle. Thomas had made a whole production out of sniffing it, swirling it, and finally approving it like he was granting knighthood to a particularly promising grape. I'd smiled and nodded through the whole routine, even though I could have bought a perfectly decent bottle for $30 at Trader Joe's and been just as happy. But that wasn't the point of tonight. Tonight wasn't about the wine or the duck or even the overpriced ambience. Tonight was theater, and I had the best seat in the house. The conversation had been predictably brutal. Patricia spent the first course asking me pointed questions about career trajectory and professional development, which was her polite way of asking why I wasn't as rich or important as her husband. Courtney kept making these snide little comments about how cute it was that I still drove a car that was more than 3 years old, like automotive age was somehow a reflection of moral character. And Madison? Madison just sat there with this smug little smile, occasionally chiming in with observations that felt less like conversation and more like targeted airstrikes. You know what I love about you, she'd said during the appetizer course, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that comes right before the knife goes in. You're so humble, so content with simple things. The way she said simple made it sound like a diagnosis. I'd smiled, didn't respond, just cut into my seared scallop and let her words bounce off me like rain off Gore-Tex. See, they've been doing this dance for years. The subtle digs, the backhanded compliments, the constant reminders that I'd married up and should be appropriately grateful for the privilege of breathing their rarefied air. And for years, I'd taken it, smiled through it, played the part of the humble husband who'd won the lottery by landing Madison Fallner. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had a secret sitting in my briefcase like a loaded gun, and I was just waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. Thomas cleared his throat, the universal signal that he was about to say something he considered profound, and raised his glass. A toast, he announced, his voice carrying that particular quality of a man who's used to people shutting up when he talks. To family, to success, and to knowing your place in the world. The table raised their glasses obediently. I raised mine too, watching the candlelight play off the wine like liquid rubies. Knowing your place in the world. That was rich coming from a man who'd spent the last decade treating me like I was part of the furniture, useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time. That's when Madison struck. She turned to me with that smile, the one that looked warm from a distance but felt like frostbite up close, and said loud enough for Dante, and probably half the restaurant to hear, "Well, Thank God you finally sold that little tech company of yours. Maybe now you can actually afford to pay me back what I'm owed for carrying this marriage financially all these years." The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind that's not quite mean enough to be called cruel, but definitely not friendly enough to be called kind. Patricia smirked into her wine glass. Courtney actually snorted, which was impressive considering how much Botox she'd had done recently. And Thomas? Thomas just sat there with this tight little smile, his eyes glinting with what I can only describe as paternal approval. His daughter had landed a good one. A zinger. A real barn burner. I took a slow sip of my obscenely expensive wine and set the glass down with exaggerated care. Then I smiled. Really smiled, the kind of smile that reaches your eyes and makes people wonder what you're thinking, and raised my glass one more time. "You're absolutely right, Madison," I said, my voice steady and warm and perfectly pleasant. "To new beginnings." They clinked their glasses against mine, laughing and nodding and completely missing the subtext. They thought I was being gracious. They thought I was accepting my role in their hierarchy. They thought I was toasting to my good fortune and finally being able to contribute meaningfully to the Faulkner family legacy. They had no idea I was actually starting the countdown to what I'd privately dubbed Operation Poetic Justice. See, the contract in my briefcase wasn't just any contract. It was the signed, sealed, and legally ironclad transfer of ownership for my little tech company, the one Madison had just dismissed with such casual cruelty, to Richard Langston. And if that name doesn't ring a bell for you, it definitely rang a bell for Thomas Faulkner, because Langston was the man Thomas had publicly eviscerated in a Forbes interview 5 years ago, calling him a cautionary tale about confusing luck with talent. Langston had never forgotten that, and neither had I. My company wasn't some cute startup. It was the backbone of half the shipping logistics on the western seaboard, including, and here's where it gets really fun, the entire operational infrastructure of Faulkner Industries. Every shipment, every delivery, every supply chain optimization that had kept Thomas's empire running like a well-oiled machine for the past 8 years. That was my software, my code, my little tech company. And as of 3 hours ago, it all belonged to Richard Langston, along with a very special clause, Section 14.2.3, if you're keeping track at home, that permanently banned Faulkner Industries and Thomas Faulkner personally from ever accessing that technology again. I sat there at that overpriced table, surrounded by people who'd spent years treating me like a particularly useful appliance, and I couldn't help but smile into my duck confit. This dinner, this painful, excruciating performance of family togetherness, was essentially the last meal before a slow-motion corporate apocalypse. And they were too busy laughing at me to see the mushroom cloud forming on the horizon. Dante came by to ask if we wanted dessert. I ordered the chocolate souffle. After all, when you're about to burn down an empire, you might as well enjoy the pastry course. The drive home from Marchand's took about 40 minutes, which gave me just enough time to decompress from the psychological warfare that passed for family dinner with the Faulkners. I had the radio tuned to some jazz station that played the kind of smooth, instrumental stuff that makes you feel like you're in a noir film, even if you're just sitting in traffic on the 405 watching a Tesla nearly sideswipe a soccer mom in a Suburban. Madison had taken her own car. She always did when we went to her parents' place, claiming she needed the autonomy of her own vehicle, which I'm pretty sure was code for, "I might want to leave early if you embarrass me." I pulled into our driveway around 10:30, the garage door rolling up with that familiar mechanical groan that I'd been meaning to get fixed for about 6 months, but never quite got around to. The house was one of those modern minimalist numbers in the hills, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were living in an IKEA catalog. Madison had hired some interior designer named Sven or Bjorn or whatever Scandinavian name was trendy that year, and he'd turned the place into a monument to aggressive neutrality. Everything was white, gray, or that particular shade of beige that design magazines call grayish, because apparently we've run out of actual colors to name. But there was one room in this temple of tasteful emptiness that remained mine. My office. My sanctuary. My so-called man cave. Though I'd always hated that term because it made me sound like some dude who spent his weekends watching football and drinking beer from a helmet, which, for the record, I've never done, though I'm not judging anyone who has. The room was tucked away in the back corner of the house, past the guest bedroom that no guests ever used, and the home gym that Madison visited about as often as I visited the dentist, reluctantly and under duress. I'd claimed this space early in our marriage, back when we were still pretending to compromise on things, and I designed it exactly the way I wanted it. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined 2 walls, stuffed with everything from first editions of Hemingway to dog-eared paperbacks of science fiction novels I'd read in college. There was a vintage leather chair that I'd found at an estate sale in Pasadena, the kind that creaked when you sat in it and smelled faintly of old tobacco in better times. My desk was an actual wooden desk, not some glass and chrome monstrosity, with enough surface area to spread out papers and actually work instead of just looking aesthetically pleasing for Instagram. Madison had always hated this room. She'd walked in once, shortly after we moved in, wrinkled her nose like she'd smelled something expired in the back of the fridge, and announced that it had too many Darkwood vibes. As if Darkwood was somehow offensive. As if centuries of human civilization hadn't been perfectly happy with Darkwood vibes. She'd suggested, multiple times, with increasing levels of passive aggression, that we could turn it into a yoga studio because apparently the world desperately needed more exposed brick, succulents, and places for wealthy women to do downward dog while listening to whale sounds. I'd politely declined. Well, I'd said, no thanks, and then changed the subject, which is basically the same thing in marriage currency. Tonight, I closed the door behind me with a satisfying click, the kind that says the outside world stops here. I loosened my tie, one of those expensive silk numbers that Madison had bought me because she said my old ties made me look like a middle manager at a regional bank, and tossed my suit jacket over the back of the leather chair. Then I walked over to the small bar cart in the corner, the one piece of furniture in this entire house that truly understood me, and pulled out a bottle of Glendronach 18. Now, I'm not usually the kind of guy who gets precious about scotch. I'm not going to bore you with tasting notes or tell you I'm detecting hints of caramelized pear and ancient Scottish peat moss, or whatever nonsense people say when they're trying to justify spending $200 on a bottle of brown liquid. But Glendronach 18 is special. It's the kind of scotch that makes you slow down, think about your choices, and reconsider your entire life trajectory. It's smooth and complex and just dangerous enough to remind you that you're drinking something that could strip paint if you used it wrong. I poured myself 2 fingers, maybe 3, if we're being honest, because it had been that kind of night, and settled into my chair with my laptop. The leather creaked in greeting, like an old friend saying, "Welcome back, let's process this nonsense together." I took a slow sip, felt the warmth spread from my throat down to my chest, and opened my email. There it was, sitting at the top of my inbox like a love letter from the universe. Contract execution confirmed, Langston Enterprises. I clicked it open, even though I'd probably read this email 15 times already since it had arrived that afternoon. Deal closed. Intellectual property transferred. All assets and proprietary technology now under the ownership of Langston Enterprises, effective immediately. Clean. Legal. Irrevocable. The kind of thing that makes lawyers smile in their sleep. And there, buried in the forwarded attachments, was the real masterpiece. Section 14.2.3 of the contract, the clause that I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting with my attorney, a brilliant woman named Janet who charged $400 an hour and was worth every penny. The section that permanently restricted Faulkner Industries, along with Thomas Faulkner personally, from accessing, licensing, or utilizing any technology developed or owned by my former company. In layman's terms, I just cut off their oxygen supply. See, here's the thing nobody at that dinner table understood, because they'd never bothered to ask, and I'd never bothered to explain. My little tech company wasn't little. It was the invisible backbone of modern logistics. We developed proprietary software that optimized shipping routes, managed warehouse inventory, coordinated supply chains, and basically made sure that products got from point A to point B without ending up in point Q by mistake. Half the shipping operations on the western seaboard ran on my code. Amazon used a modified version of our system. Target, Walmart, and yes, Faulkner Industries. For 8 years, Thomas's empire had been running on infrastructure that I'd built. Every on-time delivery, every efficient warehouse operation, every quarterly earnings report that made him look like a genius in front of shareholders, That was my software working in the background like a really competent stage crew that nobody ever sees or thanks. They'd been laughing at the man who built their oxygen tank, making jokes about my little tech thing, while their entire operation depended on it. Madison had literally just mocked me for finally selling it, not realizing that she was essentially making fun of the guy who'd been keeping her family's fortune afloat. And now? Now that oxygen tank belonged to Richard Langston, a man who had exactly zero reasons to be charitable to the Faulkner family. A man who'd been publicly humiliated by Thomas in the pages of a magazine that people actually read, called a cautionary tale, like he was some kind of business world nursery rhyme. Langston had smiled through it at the time. Given the requisite, I respect his opinion statement to the press, and then apparently spent the next 5 years quietly plotting the kind of revenge that requires patience, capital, and a really good memory. When he'd approached me 6 months ago, casually, at a tech conference in San Jose, over coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through an old gym sock, I'd almost said no. Almost. But then he'd mentioned Thomas's name, and something in his eyes had lit up like Christmas morning, and I'd realized we were thinking the exact same thing. The enemy of my enemy is my new business partner. I took another sip of scotch and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Tomorrow morning, when the deal went public and the tech transfer became official, Faulkner Industries would wake up to find that their entire logistics system had been retired. Not stolen, not hacked, nothing illegal, just contractually unavailable. The software would still work for existing clients, but Faulkner Industries would find themselves locked out, their access revoked, their backup systems suddenly realizing that they didn't have backup systems because they'd relied on my company for everything. They could try to rebuild it, sure. They could hire a team of engineers and spend 18 months and God knows how many millions trying to replicate what I'd built. But by then, their contracts would be in breach, their clients would have fled to competitors, and their stock price would look like it had fallen down a particularly steep flight of stairs. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone, scrolling through the usual end-of-day nonsense. Emails I'd answer tomorrow, text messages from college friends I hadn't seen in years, a notification that my Grubhub order from last week had earned me rewards points. Then I opened my banking app, just to see the number one more time. The sale had cleared that afternoon. The full amount, minus taxes and fees and all the other things that make accountants wake up screaming in the middle of the night. It was enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working another day. Enough to buy that beach house Madison had always wanted, if I were feeling generous, which I absolutely was not. I finished my scotch, set the glass down on a coaster, because I'm not a barbarian, despite what the Faulkners might think, and whispered to the empty room, "Checkmate, sweetheart." Tomorrow, the world would change for the Faulkner family. Tonight, I was just a guy in a room with darkwood vibes, good scotch, and the satisfying knowledge that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should have been worried about all along. The office park where Langston wanted to meet looked like every other soulless corporate complex in Silicon Valley. A cluster of beige buildings arranged around a sad little courtyard with landscaping that screamed, "We spent exactly the minimum required by zoning laws." There was a fountain that probably worked about half the time, some wooden benches that nobody ever sat on, and a coffee shop on the ground floor that sold $7 lattes to people who'd convinced themselves that caffeine was a personality trait. This was the kind of place where billion-dollar deals happened in conference rooms right next to vending machines that still charged $1.50 for a Snickers bar and gave you back change in nickels from 1987. I'd arrived 15 minutes early because I'm that guy, the one who shows up early to everything and then sits in his car scrolling through his phone, pretending to be busy so he doesn't look desperate. The parking garage smelled like concrete and poor life choices, and the elevator played that special brand of music that makes you reconsider whether modern civilization was really worth all the effort. When I finally made it to the third floor, Suite 312, I found myself standing in front of a door with frosted glass and the kind of generic nameplate that could have belonged to a law firm, a tech startup, or a very elaborate money laundering operation. I knocked twice. A voice from inside said, "It's open," which felt weirdly casual for a meeting that was about to reshape the entire landscape of West Coast logistics and possibly destroy a corporate dynasty in the process. Richard Langston was standing by the window when I walked in, his back to me, staring out at the parking lot like it held the secrets of the universe instead of just a bunch of Teslas and one guy's beat-up Honda Civic that had definitely seen better days. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind of thing that makes you look like you've got your life together even if you're actually a mess on the inside. His hair was silver gray, cut precisely, and he had the kind of posture that suggested either really good yoga instruction or a childhood spent in military school. When he turned around, he was grinning. Not a friendly grin, not the kind of smile you'd give to your buddy when he shows up at your barbecue with a case of beer and some questionable potato salad. This was the grin of a man who was about to ruin someone's Christmas, New Year's, and probably their entire fiscal quarter, and he was absolutely delighted about it. "You actually came," he said, walking over to shake my hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, the handshake of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and knew exactly how much pressure to apply to seem confident without coming across as compensating for something. "You thought I wouldn't?" I asked, settling into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. The office was nicer than I'd expected given the building's exterior. Mahogany furniture, actual art on the walls instead of those generic motivational posters about teamwork and synergy, and a coffee setup that looked like it belonged in a boutique cafe rather than a temporary office space. "I thought you might have second thoughts," Langston said, sitting down across from me and leaning back in his chair like we were just two old friends catching up instead of two guys about to commit corporate homicide. Cold feet. Conscience. Whatever you want to call it. Most people don't have the stomach for this kind of thing. I smiled. Most people didn't spend the last 8 years being treated like the help at their own family dinners. He laughed at that. A genuine laugh. The kind that crinkles the corners of your eyes and makes you seem almost human. "Fair point. You want coffee? I've got a guy who brings in beans from some farm in Guatemala where they handpick each one and sing to it, or some nonsense. Cost a fortune, but it's actually pretty good." "I'm fine," I said. "Let's just get this done." Langston's expression shifted slightly, the humor fading into something more serious, more focused. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, because apparently even in the digital age, the really important stuff still gets printed on actual paper, and slid it across the desk toward me. "The final contract," he said. "Everything we discussed, all the clauses we negotiated, the whole 9 yards. My legal team looked it over about 17 times. Your lawyer, Janet, she's scary, by the way. I like her. She signed off on everything yesterday afternoon. This is it. The moment of truth, as they say in movies right before someone makes a terrible decision." I picked up the folder and opened it, even though I'd already memorized every single word of this contract. I'd read it so many times that I could probably recite it in my sleep. But there's something about holding the physical document in your hands that makes it real, that transforms it from an abstract concept into something concrete and irreversible. The contract was straightforward enough on the surface. Transfer of ownership, intellectual property rights, financial terms, all the standard stuff that makes lawyers feel like they're earning their hourly rate. But then there was Section 14.2.3, buried on page 27 like a landmine waiting to go off. The clause that permanently, irrevocably, in perpetuity banned Faulkner Industries and Thomas Faulkner personally from accessing, licensing, or utilizing any technology developed by my former company. It was the atomic bomb, the kill shot, the thing that would turn Thomas Faulkner's empire from a smoothly running machine into a very expensive pile of scrap metal. Langston was watching me read, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "You sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like genuine concern, which was weird considering he had just as much to gain from this deal as I did. "Once we sign this thing, there's no takebacks, no do-overs. The clock starts ticking, and it doesn't stop until everything they've built comes crashing down." I looked up from the contract and met his eyes. "No leaks, no headlines," I said, repeating what we'd agreed on from the beginning. "We do this in silence. Clean. Professional. By the time they figure out what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it." He nodded slowly, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a pen, one of those fancy fountain pens that people who take themselves too seriously always carry around like it's some kind of status symbol. He clicked it once, a sharp sound that felt weirdly final in the quiet office. "You know what Thomas said about me in that Forbes interview?" Langston asked, his voice casual but with an edge underneath it like a knife wrapped in velvet. He said I was a cautionary tale, said I'd mistaken luck for talent, and that the market would eventually correct my undeserved success. That article came out the same week my daughter graduated from Stanford. She called me crying because her friends had read it and were asking if our family was going broke. I remember, I said quietly. I'd read that interview when it came out, back when I'd still been naive enough to think that Thomas's cruelty was just business, just the way powerful men talked about their competition. I hadn't realized then that cruelty was actually his love language. Langston picked up the contract and flipped to the signature page. He read through section 14.2.3 one more time, his eyes scanning the legal language that would permanently ban the Fallners from the technology that kept their empire running. Then he let out a low whistle, the kind of sound you make when you see something impressive or terrifying or both. "You're colder than I remember," he said, looking up at me with something that might have been respect or might have been fear or might have been a mixture of both. I smiled. "No, just efficient." He signed his name with a flourish, the fountain pen scratching across the paper with a sound that felt like history being written. Then he slid the contract back across the desk to me, along with the pen. My turn. I picked up the pen. It was heavier than I expected, substantial, the kind of object that made you feel like what you were doing mattered, and found the signature line. My hand hovered over the paper for just a second, a tiny moment of hesitation where my brain tried one last time to talk me out of this. But then I remembered Madison's voice at dinner, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, mocking me for my little tech company. I remembered Thomas's tight smile of approval, like he was proud of his daughter for putting me in my place. I remembered 8 years of being invisible, of being the punchline, of being treated like furniture that occasionally made useful contributions to the household. I signed my name. The Empire's clock officially started ticking. We shook hands again, and Langston walked me to the door, still grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said. "Let's do this again sometime. Maybe over that expensive coffee." "Maybe," I said, though we both knew this was probably the last time we'd ever see each other. We'd gotten what we wanted. The rest was just watching the dominoes fall. By the time I reached my car in the parking garage, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the notification, "Transfer confirmed. Funds deposited. Deal complete." It had started raining while I was inside. One of those sudden California drizzles that comes out of nowhere and makes everyone forget how to drive. I sat in my car, turned on the wipers, watched them sweep back and forth across the windshield in a steady rhythm, and whispered to nobody in particular, "Checkmate, sweetheart." Then I drove home through the rain, already wondering how long it would take for the Fallners to realize their entire world was about to implode. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of high-pitched laughter drifting through the house, like some kind of audio assault weapon designed specifically to ruin a perfectly good Saturday. I checked my phone, 9:30, which meant Madison was already up and entertaining, because God forbid she ever sleep past 9 on a weekend like a normal human being who appreciates the concept of rest. I could hear voices coming from the back patio, that particular frequency of female conversation that sounds like a cross between a book club meeting and a corporate espionage operation. I threw on a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, the weekend uniform of men everywhere who've given up trying to impress anyone, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen smelled like overpriced coffee and whatever organic pastries Madison had probably ordered from that bougie bakery in Los Feliz that charged $14 for a croissant, because it was hand-laminated by a French guy named Pierre. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the ridiculously complicated espresso machine that had more buttons than the space shuttle and cost about as much, then casually wandered over to the window that overlooked the patio. There she was, holding court like some kind of suburban queen, surrounded by her usual entourage. Serena Blackwell sat to her left, all designer sunglasses and strategically highlighted hair, looking like she'd just stepped out of a Real Housewives casting call. Serena was married to some hedge fund guy who spent most of his time either on a golf course or having affairs with his executive assistant. Everyone knew it, including Serena, but nobody talked about it because that would violate the sacred code of rich people pretending everything was fine. To Madison's right was Jill Vanderberg, who'd gone to USC with Madison and hadn't had an original thought since graduation, which was impressive in its own way. Jill was the kind of person who waited to hear what everyone else thought about something before forming an opinion. Like she was constantly taking polls before deciding whether she liked Thai food or preferred her coffee with almond milk. They were drinking mimosas, because apparently it's not day drinking if you add orange juice and call it brunch, and picking at a spread of fruit, cheese, and those aforementioned $14 croissants that probably tasted exactly like the ones from Costco, but came with significantly more smugness per bite. I opened the kitchen window just a crack, just enough to hear their conversation without being obvious about it. Call it reconnaissance. Call it gathering intelligence. Call it being petty and nosy. Whatever you want to call it, I was doing it. So he actually sold it? Serena was saying, leaning forward with the kind of fake interest that people use when they're fishing for gossip they can weaponize later. The whole company? Just like that. Madison nodded, taking a delicate sip of her mimosa like she was in a commercial for expensive champagne. Finally, all those nights locked away in his little nerd cave, playing with his computers or whatever he does in there. At least it paid off for once. The way she said nerd cave made it sound like I'd been living in a basement somewhere conducting questionable experiments instead of, building the software infrastructure that kept her family's empire running. How much did he get? Jill asked, because of course that was her first question. Jill measured success exclusively in dollars and square footage. Madison waved her hand dismissively. Enough. He won't tell me the exact number, but his lawyer let it slip that it was substantial. She did air quotes around the word substantial, which felt unnecessarily dramatic, but very on-brand for Madison. Serena whistled low. Well, at least now he can finally contribute properly. I mean, no offense, babe, but it's been what, 8 years? And you've basically been carrying the financial load this whole time with your family money and your consulting work. I nearly spit out my coffee. Her consulting work? Madison did brand consulting for her friends' vanity projects, helping them pick color schemes for their boutiques and decide whether their Instagram aesthetic should be minimalist chic or bohemian luxury. She made maybe $40,000 a year, and that was in a good year when she actually felt like working. Meanwhile, I'd been pulling in multiple six figures since we got married, but apparently that didn't count because it didn't come with the Faulkner name attached to it. Honestly, I'm just glad he can finally afford to buy me that beach house in Malibu I've been wanting, Jill added, giggling like she'd said something clever instead of something that made me want to throw my coffee mug through the window. You deserve it, Mads. You've been so patient with him. Patient. Right. Patient like a cat is patient with a mouse it's playing with before the kill. Madison laughed. That crystalline, perfectly practiced laugh she'd probably learned at some finishing school or from watching too many Katherine Heigl movies. Well, we'll see. I'm meeting with my lawyer next week to discuss our options. I think it's time we had a serious conversation about our financial arrangement. Now that he's actually worth something, we should probably restructure how we handle marital assets. I'd heard enough. I closed the window quietly and pulled out my phone, navigating to our home network settings. We had one of those smart home systems that controlled everything: lights, temperature, security, and yes, the Wi-Fi. Madison had insisted on it because she'd seen it in some celebrity's house tour on Architectural Digest, and decided we needed to be able to control our window blinds with an app like civilized people. I pulled up the Wi-Fi settings and changed the password. The old one had been Madison F 2017, the year we got married, because she was sentimental like that. The new one was By Felicia 2025. I hit save and watched as every device on the network disconnected simultaneously. Within seconds, I heard Serena's voice from the patio. Wait, did your Wi-Fi just die? That's weird, Madison said, and I could practically hear her frowning. It was working fine a second ago. I smiled into my coffee and headed back upstairs to my office. Time for phase 2. I opened my laptop and pulled up the email I'd been drafting for the past week. The one I'd written and rewritten about 40 times, trying to get the tone exactly right. Professional but firm. Clear but not cruel. The kind of email that says, I'm done, but I'm going to handle this like an adult, without actually using those words. 2. Email protected. Subject, dissolution of marriage, asset documentation required. Martin, I'm filing for divorce from Madison Faulkner. Please prepare the necessary documentation. I've attached a preliminary asset disclosure form for your review. You'll note that the recent sale of my company is not included in marital assets. as the sale was finalized prior to filing and falls under separate property as defined in our prenuptial agreement, Section 7, subsection C, which Madison herself insisted upon to protect her consulting income. I'm prepared to offer Madison the house, the joint savings account, the investment portfolio we built together, and her choice of vehicles. I'll retain my personal accounts, my retirement fund, and obviously, the proceeds from my company's sale. Please advise on next steps. Best regards. Name. I read it over one more time, made a minor adjustment to the wording in the second paragraph, and hit send. The email whooshed out into the digital void, carrying with it the official end of 8 years of marriage and the beginning of what I was privately calling Operation Fresh Start. Then I forwarded the same information to Madison's lawyer, Marcus Webb, a guy who looked like he bought his suits at the same place as TV lawyers and had a handshake that felt like grabbing a wet fish. I'd met him once at a charity event and immediately pegged him as the kind of attorney who was great at writing strongly worded letters but would fold faster than origami in an actual courtroom. I sat back in my chair and waited. In my experience, lawyers moved at exactly 2 speeds: glacially slow when you needed them to hurry, and panic attack fast when they realized something had gone horribly wrong. Marcus Webb chose panic attack fast. My phone rang exactly 10 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. Then Madison's lawyer called. Then my lawyer called to tell me that Madison's lawyer had called her in what she described as a state of heightened confusion bordering on mild hysteria. 5 minutes after that, I heard the front door slam open with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. High heels clicked across the hardwood floor like gunfire, rapid, angry, and heading straight for my office. Madison didn't bother knocking. She burst through the door still wearing her brunch outfit, her face flushed either from the mimosas or the rage or possibly both, her phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. "You filed?" she demanded, her voice hitting that particular pitch that dogs probably found uncomfortable. I swiveled my chair to face her, completely calm, coffee still in hand. "Yes." "You sold the company?" The disbelief in her voice would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. "Yup." "How much?" She stepped closer, like proximity would somehow force the answer out of me. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let the silence hang there for just a second longer than was comfortable, and then smiled. Enough to buy peace and quiet. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. For maybe the first time in our entire marriage, Madison Faulkner was actually speechless. It was beautiful, in a schadenfreude kind of way. Her phone buzzed. She looked down at it, her face going from red to pale in about 3 seconds flat. I'm guessing that was Marcus Webb sending her the asset disclosure, the one where she'd realized that her little nerd cave had been worth more than everything else we owned combined, and now it was gone. She looked back up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but the dawning realization that she'd miscalculated. Badly. "We're going to fight this," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "You can try," I replied, "but you might want to reread that prenup you insisted on. Section 7. You remember, the one where you wanted to make sure your consulting income stayed separate? Turns out that clause works both ways." She left without another word, heels clicking back down the hallway, slightly less confident than when they'd arrived. My phone buzzed with an email from Janet. "Marcus Webb just called me 3 times. I think he might be crying. Well done. Phase 1 complete." I smiled, finished my coffee, and got back to work. After all, revenge is exhausting, and I still had 9 more phases to go. The beautiful thing about revenge, and I mean really well executed, meticulously planned revenge, is that you don't have to do anything once you've set it in motion. You just sit back, pour yourself another cup of coffee, and wait for the dominoes to fall. It's like watching a Rube Goldberg machine, except instead of a ball rolling through a series of tubes and hitting a lever that rings a bell, it's a corporate empire slowly realizing that their entire infrastructure just evaporated like morning dew in the California sun. The morning after I changed the Wi-Fi password and filed for divorce started out pretty normal. I woke up around 8, which is late for me, but early enough that I still felt like a functioning adult. Madison's side of the bed was empty and perfectly made, which told me she'd either left early or hadn't come home at all. My money was on the latter. She'd probably spent the night at her parents' place, crying into her mother's expensive shoulder pads about how her ungrateful husband had the audacity to file for divorce after she'd graciously tolerated his existence for 8 years. I made myself some pancakes because that's what you do when your life is falling apart or coming together, depending on your perspective. You make pancakes. There's something therapeutic about watching batter turn golden brown on a griddle, knowing that in a few minutes you'll have a stack of carbs and butter that makes everything seem slightly better. I was contemplating whether to add chocolate chips or just stick with classic maple syrup when my dog, Murphy, a golden retriever with the IQ of a potato but the heart of a champion, padded into the kitchen and sat at my feet with those big, hopeful eyes that dogs use to guilt you into sharing your food. "You want some pancakes, buddy?" I asked, which was a stupid question because Murphy wanted pancakes the same way fish want water. I tossed him a piece, watched him catch it midair with the kind of athletic precision he definitely didn't apply to anything else in his life, and felt pretty good about the day ahead. That's when Madison's phone started ringing in the other room. She'd left it on the charger in the living room, which was unusual because Madison treated her phone like a vital organ that couldn't be separated from her body for more than 30 seconds without triggering some kind of biological crisis. I heard it buzzing from the kitchen, that insistent, demanding buzz that says, "This is important. Pick me up right now or face the consequences." I ignored it. Not my phone, not my problem. It stopped ringing, then started again, then stopped, then started again. Murphy looked up at me with concern, like even he understood that this level of persistent calling meant something had gone catastrophically wrong somewhere. I walked into the living room, pancakes still in hand, because I wasn't going to let a phone call interrupt breakfast, and glanced at the screen. The caller ID read, Fallner Group CFO, Michael Chun. I'd met Michael once at some company holiday party where everyone pretended to enjoy small talk, while secretly calculating how early they could leave without seeming rude. He was a nice enough guy, competent, professional, the kind of person who always had a spreadsheet ready for any occasion. He was also the kind of guy who only called when something was on fire, metaphorically speaking. I let it go to voicemail, then watched as he immediately called back. This was getting interesting. I picked up the phone, not to answer it, just to see what was happening, and saw that Madison had 17 missed calls in the last 30 minutes. 17. Michael Chun, Thomas Fallner, someone named David Operations, and about 6 calls from Madison's mother, Patricia, which probably meant the news had already spread through the family like a virus through a preschool. The phone rang again. This time I almost answered it just to hear what Michael would say, but that felt like overplaying my hand. Better to let them panic, let them scramble, let them realize the full extent of the problem before they knew I was the cause of it. I went back to the kitchen, fed Murphy another piece of pancake, and turned on the TV. CNBC was doing their morning market coverage, showing the usual parade of stock tickers and people in expensive suits pretending they could predict the future. I flipped to a local news station. Nothing yet. Too early. The real chaos wouldn't hit the news cycle for another few hours, once the financial bloggers and trade journalists started picking up on the fact that Fallner Industries had mysteriously gone dark. My own phone buzzed. A text from Janet, my lawyer. "Are you watching the news? Check Fallner Industries stock." I pulled up a financial app on my phone, the kind that gives you real-time stock quotes and makes you feel like a day trader even though you're just some guy eating pancakes in his kitchen. I typed in the Fallner Industries ticker symbol and watched the page load. The stock was down 18% in pre-market trading. I let out a low whistle. Murphy tilted his head, confused. "It's starting, buddy," I told him, scratching behind his ears. "The great collapse of 2025. We're witnessing history here." By 10 o'clock, Madison's phone had accumulated 43 missed calls. By 10:30, someone started calling my phone. I didn't recognize the number, but it had a Los Angeles area code, which meant it was probably someone from the Fallner Empire trying to track me down like I was some kind of fugitive who'd stolen the family silver. I declined the call, then blocked the number, then made myself another cup of coffee because this was shaping up to be a longer morning than I'd anticipated, and I wanted to be properly caffeinated for the schadenfreude. At 11, the news broke. Not on CNBC or Bloomberg, but on TechCrunch. A blog post with the headline, "Major Logistics Provider Suffers Mysterious System Failure, Affects Multiple Fortune 500 Companies." The article was short, just a few paragraphs, but it mentioned that several companies, including Fallner Industries, had experienced catastrophic system failures in their logistics operations. Shipments were frozen. Warehouses were operating on manual processes. Delivery schedules were in chaos. And nobody seemed to know why. The comments section was already filling up with speculation. Software bug. Cyber attack. Insider sabotage. One person suggested it might be related to a recent corporate acquisition, which made me smile because they were closer to the truth than they realized. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Langston. "You watching this?" "It's beautiful." I texted back, like watching a symphony. He sent back a champagne emoji, which felt appropriate. By noon, the chaos had reached critical mass. I'd been monitoring the situation from my office. Murphy sprawled at my feet like a furry, judgmental therapist, watching as the Fallner Industries crisis metastasized from a technical problem into a full-blown corporate emergency. The stock was now down 23%. Trading had been halted twice for volatility. Financial reporters were scrambling to figure out what was happening. And somewhere in downtown Los Angeles, in a glass tower with too many floors and not enough common sense, Thomas Fallner was probably realizing that his entire empire had been built on a foundation that just disintegrated. I pulled up the group chat I had with a few former employees from my old company. Good people who'd moved on to other positions, but still kept in touch. Someone had posted a screenshot from inside Fallner Industries' main server room. The error message was simple, clinical, and absolutely devastating. Access denied. User restricted per contract section 14.2.3. Someone else posted, "Wait, they're banned? Who bans their own logistics provider?" Another message, "Not banned. Specifically restricted. Like by name." I heard Thomas Fallner is personally listed in the restriction clause. That's some next-level petty. I respect it. I laughed out loud, startling Murphy, who lifted his head with a look that said, "Are you okay, or are you finally losing it?" I scratched his head and went back to reading. According to my sources, and by sources I mean people who still worked in the industry and loved gossip almost as much as they loved paychecks, the scene at Fallner Industries headquarters was somewhere between a disaster movie and a dark comedy. The CIO had apparently tried to reboot the entire system, only to discover that the system wasn't broken. It was just denying them access. Like a bouncer at an exclusive club looking at their names on a list and shaking his head with a smile that said, "Not today, friend." Thomas had called an emergency board meeting, brought in their top engineers, consulted with 3 different tech companies about rebuilding their logistics infrastructure from scratch. And each time, they'd come back with the same answer. This is going to take at least 18 months and cost somewhere between $50 and $80 million, assuming we can even replicate the functionality. 18 months. In 18 months, Fallner Industries would lose every major contract they had. Their clients would migrate to competitors. Their stock would be worthless. And Thomas Fallner would go from being a Forbes cover story to a cautionary tale about what happens when you build your empire on someone else's foundation and then treat that someone like disposable furniture. I leaned back in my chair, fed Murphy the last piece of my pancake, and pulled up the stock market app one more time. Fallner Industries, down 31% and falling. Alexa, unprompted, started playing smooth jazz from my usual playlist. I didn't remember asking for music, but apparently, even artificial intelligence understood that this moment deserved a soundtrack. Life was good. The pancakes were excellent. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a dynasty was crumbling like a stale cookie, 1 percentage point at a time. "Alexa," I said, "remind me to buy champagne." "Reminder set," she replied in that calm, robotic voice. "Would you like me to suggest a wine pairing?" I smiled. "No thanks. I think this occasion pairs well with anything." I didn't witness the Fallner family emergency meeting in person, obviously, because I wasn't invited and also because I valued my remaining brain cells too much to voluntarily subject myself to that particular brand of dysfunction. But thanks to Madison's sister Courtney, who had the situational awareness of a goldfish and the impulse control of a toddler hopped up on pixie sticks, I got a pretty detailed play-by-play via a series of increasingly frantic text messages that she apparently sent to her book club group chat, which she'd accidentally added me to 6 months ago and never bothered to remove me from. The Fallner family mansion was exactly the kind of place you'd expect from people who thought subtlety was for poor people. It sat in the hills overlooking the city like a modern feudal castle, all white stone and enormous windows and architecture that screamed, "We have more money than taste, but we hired someone with taste, so it's fine. There were approximately 7,000 square feet of living space, which seemed excessive for 4 people, but I guess when you're Thomas Fallner you need room for your ego plus guests. The chandelier in the entryway alone probably cost more than most people's cars, and there were so many rooms that I'd once gotten lost trying to find the bathroom during Thanksgiving dinner and ended up in what I can only describe as a formal sitting room that nobody had sat in for at least a decade based on the dust situation. According to Courtney's breathless text updates, which she was sending in real time like she was covering a war zone for CNN, Madison had shown up around 3 in the afternoon driving like she was auditioning for Fast and Furious, nearly taking out her mother's prized rose bushes in the driveway. Patricia had apparently been in the sunroom having her afternoon tea and practicing looking disappointed in her children, which was basically her full-time job at this point in her life. Thomas was in his home office, probably staring at stock tickers and trying to manifest a solution through sheer force of will and expensive scotch. The family converged in what they called the Great Room, which was just a living room but bigger and with more uncomfortable furniture that looked expensive but felt like sitting on marble slabs. There were enough Fallners present to form a small army, Madison and Courtney obviously, plus their mother Patricia, Thomas himself, and a rotating cast of cousins, aunts, uncles, and various hangers-on who showed up whenever there was family drama, because apparently watching other people's lives implode was considered entertainment in their social circle. Courtney's first text, "OMG, Madison just arrived and she looks insane. Like her hair isn't even brushed. This is serious." Second text, "Dad is pacing. Like back and forth. Mom's drinking wine and it's only 3 p.m. Something is wrong." Third text, "Wait, why is Uncle Richard here? And Cousin Eli? This is like a full family summit. Should I be scared?" I was sitting in my office reading these updates like they were episodes of a particularly trashy reality show, Murphy snoring at my feet, a bag of popcorn open on my desk, because if I was going to watch a dynasty collapse I might as well have snacks. The meeting apparently started with Thomas doing his usual patriarch routine, standing at the head of the room like he was about to deliver the State of the Union address, his jaw tight enough to crack walnuts, his eyes doing that thing where they looked simultaneously furious and calculating. Madison sat on one of those uncomfortable couches, her hands twisted in her lap, probably realizing for the first time that being married to me had been the equivalent of sleeping next to a ticking time bomb for 8 years and never bothering to check if it was armed. "This is a disaster," Thomas had apparently announced, because the Fallners never met a dramatic statement they couldn't make more dramatic. "The company is hemorrhaging money by the hour. Our stock is in free fall. Our clients are threatening to pull contracts. And it's all because of that." And here Courtney had helpfully included that he'd used a word that I won't repeat, but rhymes with glass bowl. Patricia, according to the text updates, had immediately jumped in with her own contribution. "I told you she married beneath her station. I told you this would end badly. But no one listens to me in this family." Madison had apparently started crying at that point, which I have to admit gave me a tiny twinge of something that wasn't quite guilt, but was in the same emotional neighborhood. But then I remembered the dinner at Marchand's, the little tech company comment, the 8 years of condescension and casual cruelty, and the twinge evaporated like spit on a hot sidewalk. I didn't know, Madison had shouted, according to Courtney's increasingly detailed play-by-play. I didn't know he was planning this. I didn't know the company was that important. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. Thomas had fired back, which was probably the first accurate thing he'd said in years. You treated him like hired help. You mocked him in public. And now he's destroyed us. This was where it got really interesting, because according to Courtney, who was apparently live texting from behind a decorative column like some kind of architectural spy, Cousin Eli spoke up. Now, Eli was the family member everyone kind of forgot about. He was quiet, bookish, worked in academia doing something with economics that no one really understood or cared about. He showed up to family events, ate his dinner, made polite conversation, and then disappeared back into whatever university library he'd crawled out of. He was probably the only Fallner who'd ever treated me like an actual human being instead of a piece of furniture that occasionally had opinions. You know what's interesting? Eli had said, his voice calm in the middle of all the shouting. The room apparently went quiet because nobody expected Eli to contribute anything more substantial than pass the salt. What's interesting, Eli? Patricia had asked, her tone suggesting she didn't actually find anything interesting but was willing to humor him. I remember a family dinner about 5 years ago, Eli continued. Christmas, I think. He had just closed a major deal with Amazon. Brought it up during dessert, seemed really proud. Asked if he could present it at the next family business meeting. Thought maybe his logistics expertise could help with some of the supply chain issues Thomas was having at the time. The room stayed quiet. Courtney texted, "Why is Eli talking about ancient history? Read the room, dude." Thomas told him. Eli said slowly, like he was remembering every word, that the only seat he'd earned at any table was the kids' table. Said it in front of everyone. Laughed about it. Half the family laughed with him. I actually remembered that dinner. I'd filed it away in the mental folder labeled Reasons Why This Family Can Go Kick Rocks, which was a pretty thick folder by that point. I'd spent the rest of that Christmas drinking expensive wine and planning my exit strategy, though it had taken me another 5 years to actually execute it. The silence in the Faulkner great room must have been deafening. Courtney's next text. Oh shit. Oh shit. Dad's face just went completely white. Mom's staring at her wine glass like it has the answers to the universe. He didn't destroy you out of rage, Eli had continued, his voice still calm, still matter of fact, like he was explaining a basic economic principle to undergraduates. He destroyed you because he remembered. Every dinner, every comment, every time you treated him like he was invisible. He wasn't invisible. He was just quiet. There's a difference. Madison had apparently completely broken down at this point. Full ugly crying. The kind where your face gets blotchy and your nose runs, and you make sounds like a wounded animal. Patricia was trying to comfort her, while simultaneously glaring at Thomas like this was somehow exclusively his fault, which was rich considering Patricia had been just as bad if not worse. Thomas himself had apparently sat down heavily in one of those uncomfortable expensive chairs, looking like someone had physically punched him in the stomach. Courtney's text. This is literally the most insane thing I've ever witnessed, and I once saw a guy get arrested at Coachella for trying to steal a golf cart. Eli just mic dropped the entire family. The meeting had devolved from there into the kind of circular arguing that families excel at, everyone blaming everyone else, people bringing up grievances from years ago, someone apparently bringing up an incident from Madison's Sweet 16 party that had nothing to do with anything, but somehow became relevant in the moment. It was the kind of dysfunction that normally would have required years of therapy to unpack, except the Faulkners didn't believe in therapy because that would require admitting they had problems, and admitting they had problems would require self-awareness, which was in short supply at the mansion. But the damage was done. The truth was out there, floating in the air of that great room like toxic gas. They'd done this to themselves. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every time they'd treated me like the help instead of family. It had all been carefully cataloged, remembered, and now weaponized into the most devastating corporate takedown in recent California history. Courtney's final text of the evening. Dad just said, "How could we have been so blind?" And honestly, I think that's the most self-aware thing I've ever heard him say. Also, I'm ordering pizza because this is going to take hours, and I'm starving. Want me to add you to the order? Oh wait, you're probably not coming. Awkward. I texted back, "Thanks for the offer. Enjoy the show." She sent back a gif of someone eating popcorn and watching drama unfold, which felt appropriate. I closed my laptop, looked down at Murphy, who had woken up and was staring at me with those big, trusting eyes that dogs use to remind you that at least someone in your life thinks you're amazing, and said, "You know what, buddy? I think we dodged a bullet. Several bullets. Maybe an entire firing squad's worth of bullets." Murphy wagged his tail in agreement. Or maybe he just wanted another pancake. Either way, he had the right idea. Revenge, it turned out, didn't always require fire and fury. Sometimes it just required a good memory, a solid contract, and the willingness to let people face the consequences of their own cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, a cousin named Eli who'd been paying attention the whole time and decided to drop a truth bomb right when it would hurt the most. I went to bed that night feeling better than I had in years. I woke up the next morning to my phone vibrating like it was having some kind of electronic seizure on my nightstand. For a second, in that foggy space between sleep and consciousness where your brain hasn't quite remembered how to function like a civilized human being, I thought maybe I'd accidentally set 17 alarms or Murphy had somehow learned to use my phone and was ordering himself premium dog food from Amazon. But then I grabbed the phone, squinted at the screen through eyes that felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper, and saw that I had approximately 67 notifications across various apps, which was about 65 more than I normally got unless it was my birthday, and people were remembering I existed because Facebook told them to. The first notification was from Janet, my lawyer, who apparently didn't sleep or had consumed enough coffee to transcend normal human limitations. Her text was simple: check Bloomberg. Now. Also, you're famous. Also, I'm raising my rates. I stumbled out of bed, nearly tripping over Murphy, who decided that 6 in the morning was the perfect time to sprawl across the floor like a furry bear rug, and made my way to the kitchen. Coffee first. Always coffee first. Whatever was happening on Bloomberg could wait until I'd had enough caffeine to process information like a functional adult instead of a confused zombie. The espresso machine gurgled to life with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that only expensive Italian appliances can muster, and I pulled up Bloomberg on my phone while waiting for my cup to fill. The headline loaded slowly, because of course my internet decided this was the perfect moment to have connectivity issues. And then suddenly there it was, splashed across my screen in bold letters that seemed specifically designed to make my coffee taste even better. The quiet exit that toppled a dynasty. How one man's strategic sale dismantled a corporate empire. I actually laughed out loud, startling Murphy, who looked at me with concern like maybe I'd finally snapped, and he should start looking for a new owner who didn't make weird noises at their phone before 7 in the morning. The article was written by Sarah Chun, one of those investigative business journalists who had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in her reporting and somehow making corporate drama sound like a thriller novel. I'd read her stuff before. She'd done an expose on a tech CEO who'd been embezzling funds to buy rare Pokemon cards, which sounds ridiculous until you realize he'd spent $3 million on them. And she had a gift for making financial news actually entertaining. The article was a masterpiece. I'm not just saying that because it made me look good, though it definitely did make me look good. Sarah had somehow pieced together the entire timeline of events. The sale of my company to Langston Enterprises, the strategic timing right before I filed for divorce, the clause that banned Fallner Industries from accessing the technology they'd built their entire logistics operation on. She'd interviewed former employees, industry analysts, even some of Fallner Industries' competitors who were barely hiding their glee at watching Thomas Fallner's empire crumble like a poorly made sandcastle. But the best part, the absolute chef's kiss moment that made me want to frame this article and hang it on my wall, was the quote from Langston himself. Sarah had apparently tracked him down and asked him why he'd agreed to buy my company, and his response was pure gold. He gave me exactly what I needed to succeed in the market. His family gave me the motivation to make sure that success hurt the right people. I had to set my coffee down because I was laughing too hard to hold it safely. Langston, that beautiful, petty mastermind, had essentially admitted in a major financial publication that we'd both executed a revenge plot, and he'd made it sound like a reasonable business decision. The man deserved an award for strategic pettiness. By the time I'd finished reading the article, which also included a sidebar about the Forbes interview where Thomas had called Langston a cautionary tale because Sarah Chun did her homework, my phone was already exploding with the internet's reaction. And when I say exploding, I mean it looked like I'd somehow become the main character of Twitter without even having an active Twitter account. The hashtag #FallnerFail was trending. Number 3 in the United States, right between some political scandal I hadn't been paying attention to and a viral video of a cat that had learned to open doors. People were retweeting the Bloomberg article with commentary that ranged from impressed to absolutely feral. Someone had already made a meme using that scene from The Dark Knight where Batman is standing in front of the burning pile of money, except they'd photoshopped Thomas Fallner's face onto Batman and labeled the money Fallner Industries stock price. LinkedIn, of all places, the website where people normally posted about thought leadership and synergy and other corporate nonsense that made you want to throw your laptop into the ocean, had transformed into an unexpected source of entertainment. Business professionals who normally spent their time humble bragging about their promotions and sharing inspirational quotes over pictures of sunrises were suddenly writing think pieces about my situation like I was a case study in strategic career management. One post from a guy named Derek Chun, who listed himself as a serial entrepreneur disruptor coffee enthusiast, had gone semi-viral with the caption, This is what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. The people you ignore today might be the ones dismantling your empire tomorrow. Respect is earned, not given. Also, always read your contracts. Hashtag fallen or fail, hashtag leadership, hashtag know your worth. Derek had 17,000 likes and counting. I'd never met Derek. I wasn't entirely sure Derek was a real person and not just an algorithm designed to generate LinkedIn content. But I appreciated his support nonetheless. Another post, this one from a woman named Priya Sharma who worked in tech consulting, had turned the whole situation into a poetry reading about underrated spouses and corporate revenge. I'm not kidding. She'd written an actual poem. It was called Ode to the Husband They Underestimated, and it included lines like, while they laughed at dinner tables, he coded their demise, line by line. It wasn't going to win any literary awards, but it had 8,000 likes, and the comments were full of people sharing their own stories about being underestimated by wealthy in-laws. The internet had decided I was iconic, which was a weird feeling considering I'd spent most of my adult life trying to be invisible and uncontroversial. But apparently strategic revenge was trending, and I was the poster child for it. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Hey, it's Eli. Courtney gave me your number. Hope that's okay. Just wanted to say well played. Family's still in meltdown mode. Mom's drinking mimosas for breakfast. Dad's on his third emergency board meeting. It's chaos. Also, that Bloomberg article is incredible. You're a legend. I texted back. Thanks for the truth bomb yesterday. Heard it landed pretty hard. Someone had to say it. They've been insufferable for years. Honestly, watching them face consequences for once is the best entertainment I've had since I discovered true crime podcasts. I liked Eli. Eli got it. By lunchtime, Madison had apparently lost 3 speaking engagements. I knew this because Courtney, still helpfully providing updates from inside the disaster zone, had texted to let me know that the women's business conference where Madison was supposed to talk about building your brand through authentic connection had politely uninvited her, citing scheduling conflicts. That definitely had nothing to do with the fact that her brand was now associated with catastrophic failure and her authentic connection had been with systematically destroying her husband's self-worth for 8 years. Madison's friends were apparently having crisis meetings of their own, trying to figure out how to respond. According to Courtney's play-by-play, Serena had texted Madison, "Are you okay? Do you need anything? Also, I'm here for you, but I can't be publicly here for you right now because my husband's company does business with some of your dad's competitors, and it's complicated." Jill had been slightly more direct. "Girl, he's iconic. I'm sorry, but also you kind of had it coming. Can we still do brunch on Thursday?" I didn't post anything on social media. Didn't need to. The story was telling itself, spreading across the internet like wildfire through dry brush, and my silence was apparently making me even more mysterious and therefore more interesting. Someone on Twitter had started a thread speculating about what I was doing right now. Theories ranged from probably on a beach somewhere sipping expensive drinks to definitely planning his next move, because people like this always have a next move. The truth was significantly more boring. I was sitting in my office, eating leftover pizza for lunch, watching Murphy chase his tail in circles, and occasionally checking my phone to see what new chaos had erupted in the last 5 minutes. Revenge, it turned out, was even better when it went viral. I didn't have to do anything except exist and watch the internet do its thing, turning my personal grievances into a cultural moment and Madison's family into a cautionary tale about treating people with basic human decency. My phone buzzed one more time. "Janet, you seeing this? You're trending." This is the weirdest case I've ever worked on, and I once represented a guy who got divorced because his wife found out he was married to his Tesla. Enjoy it. You've earned it. I smiled, took a bite of cold pizza, and thought about how sometimes the best revenge isn't just served cold. It's served publicly, with social media commentary and LinkedIn poetry on the side. I wasn't there when Madison stormed into Martin Glay's office like a Category 5 hurricane wearing Louboutins, but I got a pretty detailed account from Martin's paralegal, a sharp woman named Rosa who I'd worked with during the prenup negotiations and who apparently had zero loyalty to Madison and a great appreciation for office drama. Rosa texted me the highlights about an hour after the meeting, complete with commentary that suggested she'd enjoyed every minute of watching Madison's reality crumble like a stale cookie. Martin Glay's office was located in one of those glass towers in Century City, where every floor looked exactly the same, and the elevators played smooth jazz like they were trying to hypnotize you into accepting your legal bills without complaint. The place screamed expensive lawyer from the moment you walked in. Marble floors, abstract art that probably cost more than a car, a reception desk staffed by someone who looked like they'd been hired specifically to make visitors feel underdressed and inadequate. Martin himself was exactly the kind of lawyer you'd expect from Madison's social circle. Mid-50s, suspiciously good hair that defied the normal laws of male pattern baldness, suits that probably required their own insurance policy, and a handshake that Rosa had once described as like grabbing a fish that had given up on life. I'd met him exactly twice during our marriage. Once at a charity gala where he'd spent 20 minutes telling me about his vacation home in Cabo and his daughter's acceptance to Yale, neither of which I'd asked about. And once during the prenup negotiations, where he'd represented Madison's interests with the enthusiasm of someone who was billing $400 an hour and wanted to make sure he got to at least hour number 10 before actually accomplishing anything useful. According to Rosa, Madison had arrived at the office around 2 in the afternoon without an appointment, which was apparently very on-brand for Madison because she thought the normal rules about scheduling didn't apply to people who'd been written about in the lifestyle section of Los Angeles magazine. She'd blown past the receptionist, a patient woman named Gloria who'd worked there for 15 years and had seen every type of client meltdown imaginable, and headed straight for Martin's corner office like she was storming the beaches of Normandy. Martin had been on a conference call with another client, probably charging them $600 an hour to listen to him say, "I understand your concerns in increasingly expensive ways," but Madison didn't care. She'd apparently thrown open his office door hard enough that it bounced off the wall and left a small dent, which Gloria would later note in the repair request she submitted to building management. "We need to talk," Madison had announced, her voice at that particular pitch that suggested she was about 3 seconds away from either crying or throwing something expensive. "Right now? This is an emergency." Martin, to his credit, had apparently wrapped up his conference call with impressive speed, probably because the person on the other end could hear Madison's voice in the background and understood that they were about to become casualties of someone else's crisis. He'd muted his phone, apologized to his client, and turned to face Madison with the expression of a man who'd just realized his afternoon was about to become significantly more complicated. "Madison," he'd said, using that calm, measured tone that lawyers deploy when they're trying to de-escalate a situation without actually committing to helping with anything. "Why don't you have a seat, and we can discuss whatever's troubling you?" "I don't want to sit," Madison had fired back, because apparently sitting was for people who weren't in the middle of a complete life implosion. "I want you to fix this. I want you to freeze his assets. Sue him. Call every judge you know. Call the governor if you have to. I don't care what it takes, but you need to stop him." Martin had apparently glanced at Rosa, who was standing in the doorway trying very hard to look professional while also clearly dying to know what was happening. He'd given her a small nod that said, "Close the door and hold all my calls," which Rosa had done while immediately texting me. "OMG, you should see your wife right now. She's having a full meltdown, and it's glorious." "Madison," Martin had started, pulling out a legal pad like he was about to take notes on her nervous breakdown. "I need you to slow down and explain what's happened. What exactly do you want me to fix? The divorce, the sale, everything." Madison had been pacing now, her heels clicking on Martin's expensive hardwood floors in a rhythm that probably sounded like a countdown to detonation. "He filed for divorce. He sold his company. And apparently I don't get any of it. None of it. How is that possible? We've been married for 8 years." Martin had set down his fancy lawyer pen, probably a Mont Blanc that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and rubbed his temples in the universal gesture of someone who was about to deliver bad news and really didn't want to. "Madison, we discussed this during the prenup negotiations. The separate property clause was very clear. I don't care about the stupid prenup," Madison had apparently yelled, which was ironic considering she'd been the one who insisted on having a prenup in the first place. "You're my lawyer. You're supposed to protect me. That's what I pay you for." "I am trying to protect you," Martin had said, his voice taking on that edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin faster than a cheap pair of tights. but I can't protect you from your own decisions. The prenup you insisted on having, the one you made me spend 6 months negotiating, specifically protects separate property acquired before or during the marriage. Rosa's text at this point. Martin just pulled out the prenup, like he literally has it in his desk drawer. This is about to get good. Martin had apparently opened his desk drawer with the kind of ceremonial precision usually reserved for revealing important artifacts in movies, and pulled out a bound document that Madison had signed 8 years ago with a pen that probably cost more than the average person's wedding ring. He'd flipped to a specific page, page 7, according to Rosa's detailed reporting, and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. Section 7, subsection C, Martin had read aloud, his voice taking on that particular quality lawyers use when they're quoting text that's about to ruin someone's day. Any income, assets, or business interests acquired by either party during the marriage shall remain the separate property of that party and shall not be subject to division in the event of divorce, provided that said income, assets, or business interests are maintained in separate accounts and are not commingled with marital assets. He'd looked up at Madison, who had finally stopped pacing and was staring at the prenup like it had personally betrayed her. You insisted on this clause, Madison. You specifically wanted to protect your consulting income and any future business ventures from being considered marital property. Your exact words, if I recall correctly from my notes, were I don't want him to be able to claim any of my family money or my business income if things don't work out. The silence in that office must have been deafening. Rosa texted. She just went completely white, like someone drained all the blood from her face. I think she's finally realizing she played herself. But he used my family connections, Madison had said, her voice smaller now, less confident. He built his business using contacts from my father's company. Doesn't that count for something? Martin had shaken his head slowly, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. He built his business using his own skills, expertise, and capital. The fact that some of his clients happen to overlap with your family's business connections doesn't make it marital property. And even if it did, which it doesn't, he sold the company before filing for divorce. The timing is clean, legal, unassailable. So what are you saying? Madison had asked, though based on Rosa's description of her face, she already knew the answer. I'm saying that you can't freeze his assets because they're not marital assets, Martin had explained, probably charging Madison about $200 for this particular explanation. You can't sue him for the proceeds from the sale because the prenup you insisted on specifically protects separate property. And you definitely can't call the governor because, aside from the fact that I don't have the governor's number, there's nothing illegal about what he did. Madison had grabbed the prenup off Martin's desk and started flipping through it desperately, like she was hoping to find a secret clause that would suddenly make everything okay. Her hands were shaking, according to Rosa, and she kept stopping on random pages to read sections that definitely weren't going to help her case. But the house, Madison had said, looking up with what Rosa described as the most pathetic hope I've ever seen on a human face. He can't take the house. We bought that together. The house is marital property, Martin had confirmed, and for a second Madison's face had lit up with relief, which means it will be divided according to California's community property laws. You'll likely get to keep it or receive your half of the equity. Okay, Madison had breathed, clutching the prenup like a life raft. Okay, that's something. Of course, Martin had continued, and Rosa noted that his expression suggested he was about to drop another bomb. You'll need to be able to afford the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance on your own. What's your current annual income from your consulting work? The silence that followed that question apparently lasted long enough for Rosa to check her phone, respond to 2 emails, and contemplate whether she had time to grab coffee before the next scheduled appointment. About $40,000, Madison had finally whispered. In a good year. Martin had winced. Actually winced. And the annual carrying costs on the house are approximately $250,000. So unless you have significant savings or another source of income, I have to sell it. Madison had said it like someone announcing their own funeral arrangements. Or buy him out, but given the equity position and your current financial situation. Martin had trailed off, probably realizing that explaining basic mathematics to someone in the middle of an emotional crisis was not the best use of his $400 hours. Madison had finally sat down, collapsing into one of Martin's expensive leather chairs like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She'd thrown the prenup at the wall. Rosa noted that Martin had actually flinched, probably worried about the cost of repairing drywall, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. He played chess, Madison had said, staring at the wall where the prenup had bounced off and fallen to the floor. I brought checkers. Martin had picked up the prenup, smoothing out the pages with the care of someone who'd spent 6 months billing hours on that document and didn't want to see it damaged. Honestly, he'd said, his voice gentler now, almost sympathetic, I'd frame that document. It's the most expensive lesson you've ever paid for. For the first time in probably her entire life, Madison Faulkner had nothing left to say. No clever comeback, no cutting remark, no way to spin the situation into something that made her look better. She'd just sat there, according to Rosa, staring at the floor while Martin awkwardly patted her shoulder and probably mentally calculated how much he was going to charge for this session. Rosa's final text. She just left. Didn't say goodbye, didn't schedule a follow-up, just walked out like a zombie. Martin immediately poured himself a scotch from his desk bottle, and it's only 3 p.m. I think you broke your wife. Also, can I get a copy of that prenup? I want to use it as a teaching example for my paralegal certification class about the importance of actually reading what you're signing. I texted back, talk to Martin. Pretty sure attorney-client privilege applies. But I appreciate the play-by-play. Worth a shot. This was the best entertainment I've had since the guy who tried to divorce his wife because she told people he liked pineapple on pizza. You're a legend. I set my phone down and looked at Murphy, who'd been listening to me laugh while reading Rosa's texts with the confused concern of a dog who thinks his owner might be losing his mind. You know what, buddy? I said, scratching behind his ears. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your opponent gives you. And sometimes, that weapon is a prenup they insisted on having. Murphy wagged his tail, unimpressed by my philosophical musings, but always supportive nonetheless. The text came 3 days after the lawyer incident. Simple, direct, almost humble. Can we meet? Just to talk. Please. I stared at it for a solid 5 minutes, debating whether responding was worth the emotional energy. Murphy looked at me like I was being dramatic, which was fair. I texted back, neutral ground. You pick. She chose some minimalist cafe in Silver Lake. The kind of place where everything was reclaimed wood and exposed Edison bulbs, where the baristas had man buns and opinions about coffee bean origins, and where a simple latte cost $8 because it came with a lecture about fair trade practices and sustainability. The place smelled like oat milk, overpriced pastries, and the kind of earnest hipster energy that made you want to roll your eyes and order a regular black coffee, just to be contrarian. Madison was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. No makeup, hair in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer armor. She looked like a regular person dealing with regular problems, which was probably the first time in her adult life she'd experienced that particular sensation. Thanks for coming, she said quietly as I sat down. I ordered a black coffee, because of course I did, and waited. She'd called this meeting. She could start. I'm not here for money, she began, her hands wrapped around her cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I just want to understand. Why did you have to go this far? I took a slow sip of my coffee, which was actually pretty good despite the performative hipster nonsense. Understand what, Madison? How mirrors work. She flinched like I'd slapped her. Good. I pulled out my laptop, because I'd come prepared, because I was done with ambiguity, and opened a file. Faulkner Group's financials. Before and after. Stock prices, market cap, projected losses. The numbers told a story that didn't require narration. Respect is an ode, I said, turning the laptop so she could see the graphs that looked like someone had pushed a boulder off a cliff. It's earned. You spent 8 years treating me like expensive furniture. This is just me rearranging the room. Her voice broke. I didn't know they treated you like that. I did. The crying started. Quiet. Genuine. The kind that comes from actual realization rather than manipulation. I finished my coffee in silence, the cup making a hollow sound when I set it down. I stood up, grabbed my coat, left a 20 on the table even though I didn't need to. Old habits. I don't hate you, Madison, I said, looking down at her one last time. Hate takes effort. I just stopped caring. The cafe door chimed as I left. Murphy was waiting in the car, ready to go home. The courtroom echoed like a funeral. Faulkner Group bankruptcy hearing, case number whatever doesn't matter anymore. Thomas sat at the front table, gray and deflated, looking like someone had unplugged his power source. Madison sat behind him, practicing invisibility, something she'd never been good at until now. Patricia was absent, probably at home drinking wine and blaming everyone except herself. The judge was a no-nonsense woman named Martinez who'd clearly seen every variety of corporate mess and had zero patience for drama. She skimmed the sale contract, reading section 14.2.3 with what might have been amusement. "You sold your core software and listed yourself as restricted access?" she asked me directly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Congratulations. That's a first in my courtroom." By noon it was official. Faulkner Industries, deceased. Stock, worthless. Empire, dust. Outside, I sat in my car and sent one text to Madison. "Alimony's affordable now. How's your empire?" No emoji. No sarcasm. Just peace. See, revenge doesn't always mean fire and fury. Sometimes it's just silence and a really good contract they should have read more carefully. I drove home. Fed Murphy pancakes. Turned on some jazz. Life was good.